In a secret laboratory, an atomic scientist named Brian Banner has been conducting experiments with gamma radiation for the United States. Following Army orders, the physicist has done several studies to copy the starfish regeneration factor, which is capable of recovering any lost limb, and after conducting numerous tests on animals, Brian thinks it is time to start studying the effects on people, but since General Ross forbids him to use human guinea pigs, he decides to test it on himself. At first, Brian feels nothing different, but after his wife gets pregnant, he begins to sense that there is something different about his son, Bruce Banner, because the boy seems to feel no pain. To try to understand what happened, the scientist begins to do research to find out what was transmitted to the boy, but can find nothing different and decides to continue the tests on his own son. After years of being his father's guinea pig, Bruce began to develop a gigantic healing factor, even healing himself instantly after receiving a blow to the head from a baseball bat. Repentant, Brian begins to develop a cure for his son, but Colonel Ross finds the human blood samples in his lab and decides to expel him for testing on humans. Extremely angry, the physicist decides to take revenge and activates all the machines in the laboratory, releasing so much gamma radiation that the sensors in the place go off and force the military to evacuate the site. In his house, Brian's wife, Edith Banner, hears the alarm and tries to hide with her son, but her husband arrives at the house and takes her into the bedroom while Bruce remains under the table watching. Tired of waiting for his parents to leave, the boy begins to play with his teddy bears until he hears his mother calling for help from inside the room, something that completely paralyzes him. A few years later, Bruce is living with a foster family and has changed his name to Bruce Krenzier, but even in his late teens, he continues to have nightmares about his traumatic childhood. As he comes of age, Bruce is still haunted by his past, but since he is working at the Nuclear Biotechnology Institute at Berkeley, he manages to keep quite busy. On another day at work, the scientist finds the head of security, giving some instructions to the employees, but decides to ignore it and enters the facility where he finds his coworker, Betty, who reveals that the committee has set up a meeting for them to present the results of the research. In order to show some kind of progress, Betty and Bruce begin to give their all to the project that seeks to improve cell regeneration, but when they go to test it on a frog with a wound on its back, everything seems to be going well and the animal manages to recover, but several bubbles appear on its body and cause it to explode out of nowhere. After the failure, the pair of scientists begin to talk and Betty mentions Bruce's biological parents, but the man evades the subject, saying that they lost their lives when he was still little. The next morning, Betty is arriving at the institute when she runs into Glenn, a former college classmate who is now in control of several labs. Curious to see how things are going, Glenn accompanies the woman to the research room where he invites her to work in his private company, offering a salary 10 times higher, but Betty refuses the offer and orders him to leave. A few hours later, the woman is leaving the laboratory when she meets a rather suspicious new janitor in the hallway, but although she finds it strange, she just ignores him and goes home. Soon after her, Bruce meets a dog in the hallway and tries to approach it to pet it, but as the dog threatens to bite him, he just walks away. As soon as the two scientists leave, the mysterious janitor enters their office and takes a sample of Bruce's hair, who, not knowing what is happening, goes home and continues his research process until he falls asleep, waking up after another one of his nightmares. Wondering if dawn has come yet, the physicist goes to the window and looks outside, where he sees the janitor stalker watching him from the middle of the street along with the dogs, but they all mysteriously disappear. When he returns home, the janitor begins to run tests on the hair until he confirms that it is Bruce Banner, his son. The mysterious fellow is in fact Brian Banner, not knowing that his biological father is around. The next day Bruce goes to the lab where he finds Glenn talking to Betty once again. Imagining that he has come to make another proposal to take her away, the scientist says he has nothing to talk about and kicks him out, but before leaving, Glenn turns to Bruce and says that if they don't accept a collaboration, they will have to become subordinates, because the government is increasingly interested in the research and plans to use the technology to build immortal soldiers. Knowing this, the businessman intends to buy the laboratory and sends a multi-billion-dollar offer to the state, but because he is in charge of the National Security Council, the one who receives the offer is General Ross, Betty's father. After the disagreement with Glenn, Bruce goes to the test center where one of the team members finds a problem on the circuit. To resolve the situation, the scientist decides to go to the machines to help, but as he approaches, Harper ends up damaging the system with a welding machine, which causes the device to activate and start releasing radiation with them still inside. To save his colleague, Bruce puts a protective mask on Harper and throws him away, getting in front of the reactor and using his own body as a shield to absorb all the gamma radiation. After 3 days in a coma, the scientist wakes up feeling better than ever and believes that the experiment works on humans, but Betty is very worried that the man will explode like the frog, and he does everything to calm her down. After putting the woman at ease, the scientist goes back to sleep and ends up dreaming about various random things, including a colossal green creature that keeps watching him through the door. When he wakes up, Bruce sees the janitor, who explains that his real last name is Banner, but the confused scientist asks how he got in, and Brian admits that he started working there just to be near him. Thinking that the new janitor is some kind of lunatic stalker, Bruce begins to remove the medical devices to escape, but the man manages to stop him and calm him down, saying that there is something different about him, but that he can help him get information if he forgive him. Since the man doesn't know who exactly this guy is, the physicist says he has nothing to forgive and asks him to leave, forcing the old weirdo to reveal that he is his father. Shocked, Bruce says it's a lie and that his parents left when he was still a kid, but Brian reveals that he has actually spent the last 30 years locked up in some kind of government mental institution. Just then, the phone starts ringing and Brian stops his son from taking Betty's call, saying that he needs to tell something about her, but Bruce doesn't like the attitude and kicks him out of the room. The next morning, General Ross arranges a meeting with his daughter and reveals that he has discovered some troubling things about Bruce, but before she even hears what her father has to say, Betty says that she thought he wanted to see her because he was missing her, and she leaves extremely disappointed. In the laboratory, Bruce begins to analyze his own blood and can see the cells corrupted by gamma radiation multiplying, spreading almost entirely throughout his body. But while observing the samples, Betty calls him and tells him about her encounter with Ross, which makes Banner completely furious. Out of control, Bruce heads out into the halls to look for help, but before he can find anyone, his body begins to transform and he takes the form of the brutal green mutant, the Incredible Hulk. With no one to stop him, Banner begins to destroy the lab completely out of his mind, which causes the police to be called, but as the authorities are approaching, Hulk realizes that Brian is watching and begins to approach slowly. As soon as he gets close enough, Brian decides to touch his son, but when he does, Bruce begins to remember his childhood and becomes completely enraged at seeing his mother's last moments of life, losing control once again and running out of the lab through the ceiling, while the old man lies crying on the floor. The next morning, Betty goes to Bruce's house and finds him passed out in bed. After waking up, the man begins to devour his breakfast as if he hasn't eaten in weeks, and the scientist decides to ask him about what happened the night before, but he replies that he doesn't remember much, only that he had a very real dream. Intrigued, Betty asks if Banner was in the lab the night before and he answers no, but decides to tell her about his meeting with the janitor at the hospital and the conversation they had. Just then, someone knocks on the door and Betty answers, finding General Ross accompanied by several military personnel in the doorway. As soon as the woman clears the passage, the military enter and show that Banner forgot his wallet in the lab, which makes him a major suspect, but before they continue their conversation, Ross asks Betty to leave and reveals that Bruce is probably involved with the previous night's attack, asking his daughter to stay away from him while the investigations are going on. Without Betty around, Ross begins to question him about his father's whereabouts and reveals that it was he who had Brian arrested, but as Banner begins to ask questions about his past, the general believes the scientist is just pretending not to remember and decides to ban him from the lab, as well as threatening to have him arrested if he goes near his daughter again. At the same time, Betty disobeys her father and calls HR at the lab, asking for Brian's address so she can visit him and ask questions about what happened the night before. However, when he learns that General Ross is involved in the investigations, the old man starts to blame Betty and says he can't do anything to help, kicking her out of his house. While talking to the girl, Brian takes her jacket from hiding, and during the night he hands the object over to his dogs to sniff out and find her location. From his home, Bruce hears the ringing of a cell phone and begins to search for the source of the sound, finding a device hidden under the sofa cushion. When he answers, Bruce discovers that Brian was the one who hid the device, since he figured the feds would try to make him incommunicable just as they did to him. Knowing that the military could arrive at any moment, Brian cuts through the small talk and tells them that he has used Bruce's DNA to make a modification to the genetic code of his dogs, and reveals that soon these endearing super dogs will arrive at Betty's house. Not understanding why he has done this, Bruce begins to go into a state of rage and prepares to leave, but while he is thinking about how to deal with the military at the door, Glenn appears and begins to beat him up, while accusing him of having asked Ross to reject his proposal. In a hurry, Bruce tells him about the danger Betty is in and asks him to let him out, but Glenn thinks it's some kind of threat and keeps hitting him, which makes the scientist even angrier. Furious, Banner manages to throw the businessman away as his skin begins to turn green, but this is not enough to calm his anger and he continues to transform until he assumes the form of the Hulk again. In this full power mode, Bruce throws Glenn into the middle of the street and the military starts shooting at him, but this makes the Hulk even angrier, so that his body gets even bigger and he can defeat them with extreme ease. Finally free, Banner walks towards Betty's house, but when he arrives at the place, he is afraid of scaring her and hides behind a tree. This is useless, due to its colossal size. When she sees the creature before her eyes, the woman immediately recognizes Bruce and asks what has happened, but before he can even answer, the 3 mutant dogs appear and Hulk has to hide her inside the car. With Betty safe, the giant attacks the mutant dogs and manages to land a punch that knocks the creature into one of the trees, but when it recovers from the blow, the beast runs straight into Betty's vehicle, nearly breaking the windshield as it tries to attack her. Afraid that he will hurt her, Bruce throws the pit bull on top of the poodle and rushes full force at them, rolling around on the floor as the 3 beasts try to bite him. Realizing that if he continues like this he will have problems, Hulk manages to free himself from the pit bull that is biting his arm and throws them all away, but still, the dogs don't give up and start all over him, forcing Bruce to jump to dodge and make them hit each other in the air. Practically unharmed, Hulk goes up a tree and there they begin a new battle, but while he is distracted, 2 of the beasts jump on his back, causing the branch to break and everyone to plummet to the ground. As Hulk lands a punch that sends his fist through the pit bull's body, the poodle turns his attention to Betty once again and almost manages to break the windshield, but Bruce arrives at the last second and smashes the animal's head against the glass, causing it to lose his life instantly. Taking advantage of the distraction, the last dog jumps on the Hulk's back to try to surprise him, but the giant just stiffens his muscles, causing the mutant beast to break his jaw due to the force of his bite. After eliminating the last of the enemies, Hulk walks dazed to the edge of the lake where he eventually loses consciousness and returns to his human form. When he finally wakes up, Bruce walks over to Betty with great difficulty and reveals that it was Brian who sent the beasts, but while talking about what happened, the scientist ends up losing control once again, squeezing the woman's neck, leaving her terrified. After realizing what he is doing, Banner apologizes and decides to go to bed. While he is asleep, Betty calls General Ross, giving him her location and saying that she needs immediate help. Not knowing what she has done, Bruce wakes up and starts talking again about the events of the previous night, but while they are chatting, they hear a strange sound outside and Banner decides to go outside to see what it is, and is hit by a tranquilizer dart as soon as he reaches the entrance. With Banner unconscious, the military places him in a cargo helicopter and begins transporting him to a secret base, where he spends the next few days being kept unconscious, but while everyone is busy with his son, Brian breaks into the lab and activates the gamma-ray reactors on himself, developing the ability to regenerate himself just like a starfish and even gaining the ability to modify parts of his body to transform into whatever material he touches. Just as the old man develops his powers, a security guard enters the lab and tries to arrest him, but Brian easily knocks him out and fuses himself to one of the metal devices, using the weight of the object to crush the employee's body. At the secret base, Betty goes to visit Bruce and discovers that her fingerprint has been blocked in the database. When she goes to the control room, she learns that Glenn has taken over the leadership of the labs and, in addition to removing her and Bruce from the staff list, has asked that General Ross be removed from the Security Council. Knowing that there is nothing she can do, Betty returns home to find Brian sitting in the armchair in her living room. Frightened, the woman reveals that there are 2 guards outside and asks the intruder to leave, but he replies that he doesn't intend to hurt her and begins to tell her about when he found out that Edith was pregnant. According to Brian, as soon as he received the news, he immediately assumed that his son would be born with the genetic modifications because of the tests he was doing on himself, but since he had always dreamed of being a father, he decided to have the baby without telling his wife the secret. When Bruce was born, he began to imagine the horrors his son would suffer and went on to develop a cure hidden in the lab, but as we know, Ross discovered the human DNA and thought he was testing on someone else, kicking him off the project. Desperate and afraid for the future his son would have, Brian went straight home with the plan to take the boy's life to prevent him from suffering, taking Edith to his room to tell her what he intended to do, but the woman refused to allow her son to be hurt and tried to hold him, causing Brian to fall on her with the knife. At the same time, Glenn goes to the room where Banner is and starts taunting him, saying that as soon as he transforms, he will take samples of his DNA to patent and make millions of dollars, but seeing that this doesn't make Bruce angry, the businessman takes a stun gun and starts electrocuting him. Still, the scientist manages to maintain control and becomes completely calm, causing Glenn to punch him so hard that he instantly faints. With Banner unconscious, the businessman takes him to a laboratory room where he begins to emit pulses to stimulate his brainwaves, which eventually causes him to unlock memories of his mother's last moments and fill him with rage. As Bruce begins to transform, Glenn asks one of the scientists to start extracting enzymes, but the transformation is completed before the device can penetrate the skin and Hulk is able to get out of the incubation tank quite easily. Now that the monster is free, Glenn asks his employees to put him to sleep with sleeping gas, but because of his mutant genetics, the green giant is completely invulnerable to this type of fluid, which only causes him to let out a sneeze. After Hulk leaves the room, Glenn summons the containment team and asks them to try to secure the target with high-density foam, but while the group is trying to do the job, Ross sees the movement and orders everyone to evacuate the area. Still, the businessman decides to disobey and orders his team to continue the process while he takes an injector gun to try to collect the DNA samples from the Hulk, who is now totally immobilized in the foam. However, when he sees Glenn approaching, the giant gets even angrier and starts to break free. To end it all once and for all, the businessman goes to one of his employees and grabs a grenade launcher which he uses to try to stop Bruce, but because of his impenetrable skin, the projectile bounces off the Hulk and goes through the wall behind Glenn, creating a fireball that consumes everyone nearby. Still furious, Banner continues to walk around the place while destroying everything and everyone he meets along the way, forcing Ross to force a fight outside. To do this, he shuts down all the power in the place and opens the exits, allowing the Hulk to run freely through the desert, but instead of running away, Bruce goes straight to his old home, from where he is attacked by the military. After almost being eliminated by the missiles, Hulk makes a giant leap towards the desert, but still, the military does not give up and keeps going after him, using all its infantry to try to defeat him. Even though Bruce is wounded, he runs up to one of the tanks and manages to catch it with his bare hands, throwing it to the other side of the desert using only brute force, forcing the other soldiers to retreat to save their lives. Finally seeing the true potential of the enemy, Ross calls the president and asks for permission to use all available firepower, getting permission to mobilize as many troops and weapons as necessary. Unaware of this, Hulk makes his way through the desert until the general and his men finally catch up with him, beginning a massive attack that forces the target to run while trying to dodge a guided missile and machine gun fire at the same time. While escaping, Banner manages to catch one of the missiles with his hand and throws the object back at the aircraft, causing it to go into freefall almost instantly. Trying to throw off his pursuers, Hulk runs towards the rocks, from where he plans to stay hidden. But Ross does not give up and orders the helicopters to start firing, crumbling tons of rocks onto the green giant, who still manages to stay alive. After the attack, the aircraft run out of ammunition and almost out of fuel, forcing them to retreat. With things calming down, Bruce comes out from among the rocks and heads towards the city, but as he sees where he is going, Ross calls Betty and warns her that the Hulk is coming. Sometime later, Banner finally arrives in the city and stands on top of a bridge while waiting for the missile attack. But while flying over the target, the military aircraft almost collide, forcing the pilot to make a risky maneuver and get on a collision course with the concrete structure. Seeing what is about to happen, Bruce decides to jump on top of the aircraft, which causes it to lose altitude and swerve off the bridge, but taking advantage that the beast is still on the fighter, Ross orders his pilot to gain altitude until the thin air causes the Hulk to be frozen and pass out. Completely defenseless, Bruce goes into freefall until he falls to the bottom of the ocean. But even though his target is unconscious and about to drown, Ross wants to ensure the slaughter and orders his men to start bombing the water. While watching the scene from the window, Betty calls her father and tells him that it won't do any good, asking him to give her a chance to try to calm Bruce down. To do this, Ross boards a helicopter with his daughter and orders his men to locate the target, which is now moving underground in the city, destroying the asphalt where it passes. When he finally returns to the surface, Hulk sees the aircraft and picks up a rock from the ground to throw at his enemies, but when he sees Betty on board, he stops his attack and drops the rock, allowing the woman to approach and return him to his human form. After being surrendered, Bruce is taken to a shed where he has one last meeting with his father. With both of them chained up, Brian starts saying that he came to the place to see his real son, Hulk, while claiming that Bruce is just a fragile husk that will soon be removed, but seeing that this doesn't affect the man. The old man starts to freak out and insult him in front of everyone, taking a bite out of a high-voltage cable that causes his body to absorb all the electricity and leave the city completely without power. As Brian receives the electrical discharge, Bruce is filled with rage and also begins to transform, causing an explosion that takes them both to the middle of a lake not far from there. After the fall, Hulk begins to attack the enemy and gives him a lethal knockout, but Brian takes advantage of the contact to begin absorbing his radiation, merging their powers. Knowing he can't get too close, Hulk pushes the villain over a gigantic rock and throws him into the water, a very bad decision. As soon as he comes in contact with the liquid, Brian changes his physical form and manages to drag Bruce to the depths, sucking the energy out of the man who struggles not to drown. At this point, Hulk realizes that all the villain wants is his energy and decides to give it all away at once, but the radiation emitted by the future Avenger is so strong that Brian's body begins to collapse, turning into a bubble of gamma rays that starts floating in the sky. Due to the radiation emitted, Ross finally manages to locate where they are and sends a fighter to attack the targets, but upon contact with the gamma rays, the missile creates an explosion worthy of an atomic bomb, incinerating everything around it. By some miracle, Bruce manages to survive the impact and decides to leave the Hulk behind, spending the rest of his life hiding in a Panamanian jungle helping people in need. But when some criminals break in and try to steal the medicine from the sick, Banner begins to fill with rage and his eyes begin to turn the color green again. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.